Support for this podcast comes from the law firm of Davis Malm. Whether you're a developer, property owner, manager, or commercial tenant, their real estate attorneys know the lay of the land, not just the law. Learn more at davismalm.com.
WBUR Podcasts, Boston.
I'm Daryl C. Murphy, and you're listening to The Common. Boston Globe columnist Marcela Garcia, welcome back to The Common.
Thank you for having me back, Daryl.
So, Marcela, last time you were on The Common, we talked to you about a missing person. Her name is Reina Carolina Morales Rojas, and she's a recent immigrant from El Salvador who was living in East Boston, and she went missing on November 26th, 2022, and it took the Boston police more than 6 weeks to announce her disappearance, and that's a huge delay for a missing persons case. And so almost a year later, her case is still unresolved. You're one of the few who are following this story, and you recently made a trip to Reina's home country, El Salvador, to talk to her friends and family there and learn more about who she is, to give people a sense of who is missing. So first, Marcella, I want to say thank you for doing this story and bringing that dimension. I want to know what made you want to make this journey to Reina's hometown.
Thanks for that question, Daryl. I think for me, as someone who has been following the case since it was announced publicly, I had this picture of her, an image of her as someone who is missing, right? I wanted to know who she is, what she was like as a friend, as a sister, as a mother. And I realized that I couldn't do it here because she's a recent immigrant. She had only been here for a few months in Boston by the time she went missing. And that meant that her only acquaintances, they only knew her through work. They didn't really know who she is as a person. The other reason was, too, that I hadn't forgotten about the case, but I felt that the public had. And the reason why was because there hadn't been any updates to the case, and that meant there was no media coverage. And so that sort of creates a cycle of forgetfulness, if you will. It's so easy to forget missing people when they're not in the media cycle. And that ultimately has to do with law enforcement. If law enforcement has no update, if law enforcement doesn't organize a media conference or a press conference to update the public about something, that means it doesn't get any coverage.
So take us through that first day, when you land and when you start meeting people. What are some of the first things you learned about Reina?
I was immediately struck by the fact that everyone called her Carolina. And so in my head, in my mind, she was Reina Carolina or Reina, right? And I was struck by the fact that, oh my God, I didn't even know that her identity, her persona, she is Carolina, not Reina. That struck me as super important because, the whole thing about a name, right? What's in a name. Yeah. But it's just so important to identity and it helps shape in my head just who she is, right? I'm talking about Carolina, not Reina. You know what I mean? So to me, that was very important to put the right name to the face.
All right. So moving forward, we'll refer to her as Carolina. So what did you learn about Carolina from the people in her life?
It was very clear to me right away that Carolina is one of those people who is kind of like always the life of the party. She was always making jokes. She was always a very generous person with her time. I heard so many stories of how she helped neighbors, she helped friends, she helped people who needed help when she was struggling, right? She was definitely struggling economically. She was also, I learned, a very determined person. More than one of her friends told me, Carolina is a person who just achieves anything she sets her mind to. And when I asked her friends to tell me examples, someone told me that she had always wanted to buy land to build a home for her kids. She wanted to provide for her children, and she wanted to put a roof over their heads, and she wanted to do it.
How did she end up in Boston in the first place?
I had sort of heard from Alicia, from the sister, that Carolina wanted to come to the U.S. because economic opportunities in El Salvador were just bad. And basically she was sort of forced to leave because of that, because she was not making enough money and she couldn't make ends meet, right? But when I was there, I also found out or figured out that there had been this sort of, if you want to call it, pattern of instances. She had had several sexual harassment instances in the workplace, not once, but twice. Before coming, she was a police officer. I saw documentation of those sexual harassment because she went to an office that was created in El Salvador, especially for this type of workplace harassment situations. And she filed a report, and I saw the paperwork, and in the paperwork, the description of this sexual harassment incidents is very detailed. And she ended up being reassigned to a different job, which was more administrative, and she didn't like that. And then again, apparently in talking to another friend of her, she told me, and I put this in the column, that she also went through an incident of sexual harassment in this new position. And so she basically was faced with, do I find another job? Do I look for another job? Or do I stay here, or do I leave? And so ultimately that's what she decided to do. And what this reminded me of is what we hear often from immigrant advocates or even immigration lawyers that deal with cases of people who are seeking asylum, people who are fleeing violence or other situations. Reasons for leaving are so layered that they may tell you, oh, well, the reason why I left is because I didn't have a job and I needed a job, right? And so that is an economic reason. But in reality, there are so many things behind it that it's a thing on top of another thing on top of another thing. And that's what I wanted to show with Carolina, because that seems to have been the case with her.
We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back.
Politics has never been stranger or more online, which is why the politics team at Wired is making a new show, Wired Politics Lab. It's all about how to navigate the endless stream of news and information and what to look out for. Each week on the show, we'll dig into far-right platforms, AI chatbots, influencer campaigns, and so much more. Wired Politics Lab launches Thursday, April 11th. Follow the show wherever you get your podcasts.
And we're back with more from Marcela. Throughout your reporting, Carolina's sister has been her greatest advocate. What has her experience been like trying to get answers for her sister's whereabouts?
Well, she still remains very, very frustrated. I think that Alicia and the family feels discriminated against because not only the police took such a long time to publicize her case, this is not something that you make right. We'll never know what that meant in terms of missed opportunities in that period of time, right? And so she remains incredibly frustrated and angry about that. But on top of that, it is the fact that A, there's been no progress in the case because Carolina is still missing. And B, it's also the treatment that she feels she's getting. She's always the one calling. She's always the one initiating contact with law enforcement. And then she also feels this is a theme that came up over and over and over again with her, with Alicia, the sister. She feels that the case of Carolina is like a hot potato, that all involved law enforcement agencies keep passing around themselves, right? Because we have the Boston Police Department. That is where initial missing persons report was filed because Carolina was living in East Boston. But Carolina was last seen in Somerville. And so the Somerville Police Department was also involved, but also the Middlesex County District Attorney's Office is involved and the state police. And so there's all these agencies, right? And Alicia feels that it's a hot potato that they keep passing around because when she calls Boston, the detective assigned to talking to her, and he's like, oh, did you talk to Somerville? Or did you talk, oh, let me see what, and there's never an update. And so this is something that I have asked police countless of times. Can you give me a sense of what's the work that you've done? I'm not asking to speculate, or I'm not asking to put the investigation in any risk, but at least give me a measure of the work that you've put in in? How many people have you interviewed? How many leads have you followed? How many tips have come in, right? And I'm always met with complete silence. I've never answered that question.
Mm-hmm.
She feels that they're not doing enough because she just doesn't see results.
After your initial reporting on Carolina's disappearance, your colleagues at the Globe put out an investigation looking into the state's missing persons system. Since then, has the state done anything to standardize its practices around missing persons investigations?
I obviously contacted Boston Police, right? As I was getting ready to file my column, I reached out to them and said, look, I went to El Salvador, blah, 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 blah. Here are my questions again. Has there been any update, et cetera, et cetera? And what I got back first, and this is something I reported in the column, is that Boston Police tells me the state police has taken jurisdiction over this case. And so I was like, okay, what does that mean? That is news to me. So I reached out to the state police. I also reached out to the governor's office because, as you mentioned, my Globe colleague, Hannah Kruger, she did an investigative piece about how different law enforcement agencies across the state handle missing persons cases. And obviously, she found a hodgepodge of, like you said, no standards.
Mm-hmm.
After that, Governor Healy announced that she was going to establish a new missing persons unit out of the state police. And so that was good news right at the time. That was in March. And so when Boston Police Department tells me the state police has taken jurisdiction, I remembered this unit. And I thought perhaps too optimistically that maybe that meant that this new missing persons unit has Carolina's case. And so I reached out to Governor Healy's office. And meanwhile, I'm waiting to hear back from the state police. I hadn't heard anything. In the meantime, I hear back from Boston Police Department saying, actually, no, we made a mistake. State police does not have jurisdiction.
What?
It was just, again, sort of what Alicia was saying about Carolina's case, that it was like this hot potato that people are just throwing. And so then I heard back from Governor Healy's office, and to my utter disappointment, they told me that actually no, that missing persons unit has not been established because they didn't get the funding that they wanted for it. She proposed it in the budget, to create a missing and unidentified persons coordination unit, but the funding was not included in the final budget that came out of Legislative Conference Committee. And they told me that the Healy administration is evaluating alternative options to fund the work. And that's that. The other thing, and this is maybe a very small thing, I don't know if this counts, but it also struck me that in all my conversations with the Boston Police, the state police, they all refer to Carolina's family, Reina Carolina's family. And in reality, they only are in contact with Alicia. They've never interviewed the kids.
Yeah.
They've never talked to the mother. They're not talking to the family. They're talking to the sister because, like you said, she has taken it upon herself. She's become sort of like the spokesperson, right, of the family. But still, there hasn't been any that I know of, and I asked Alicia, interest or any attempt on the part of law enforcement to interview the kids.
I just wonder how her family and friends back home are keeping hope alive, How are they remaining optimistic that Carolina is alive and okay?
Well, I think one answer is faith. They're religious, and they would refer a lot to religious language like God willing and that type of stuff. Right? I think faith is a very important factor here. And the other one, I think that they're very close. The kids and the grandmother and Alicia, they're a very, very tight unit. It helps, I guess, keep the hope alive, like you said.
Marcela, I just want to say thank you so much for keeping Carolina in our consciousness. Thank you so much for your reporting and coming through to the Common to talk with us about it. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me and for giving me another chance of talking about it. Thank you for giving it attention. I really appreciate it.
That's Boston Globe columnist Marcela Garcia. And that's our show for today. Thank you so much for listening to The Common. If you want to get in touch with us, you can hit us up on Instagram at WBUR-The-Common or send us an email at thecommon@wbur.org. I'm Daryl C. Murphy, and I will talk to you tomorrow.